My name is Pastor Hal York, and welcome to Truth in the Trenches. Today we're going to be in Luke chapter 2, thinking once again about the Christmas story. I'm sure most of us have read the Christmas story so many times we could almost recite it from memory. We know the characters, we know the events surrounding the characters and his birth. We live in a day and age where we do not have to wait for the news. We watch it happen 24 hours a day. 24-hour news stations cover everything, large and small. Smartphones, YouTube, internet, literally the news is as it happens. It's in our face all the time. We don't have to wait. We just watch it happen. And we can get so conditioned to thinking this way about events that when we read about events in history, we forget it hasn't always been like that. For example, if you belong to the royal family in England and you're pregnant and you're going to have a baby, well, man, that's big news. And as soon as you go into the hospital to have that baby, the news is right there. Everybody knows. It's broadcast around the world. When you come out and you're holding that little baby, the whole world is watching. Everybody knows as it happens. It could be the next queen or the king of England. And so it's big news. And so if the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords comes to us, surely that's going to be big news. But that wasn't the way it is at all. That's not the way it was when the Lord came, certainly. And I think the Christmas story is a perfect example of how things have changed. That in and of itself should remind us of when it says Christ humbled himself in such a way that his birth was virtually unknown for many, many years, how it happened. The Christmas story is a classic illustration of how things used to be. It's very difficult for us to read the Christmas story from the perspective of those who lived it out because we have all the details and we know them by heart. And we assume everybody else did then as well because we certainly would today. We know the events, the stories surrounding the birth of Jesus, so they must have been familiar with them as well. But track with me for a few minutes and think about this. Here's what we need to stop and think. Matthew and Luke give us the details of the birth of Jesus Christ. Matthew was one of the apostles. Luke was a doctor who traveled with Paul on his missionary journeys. But the thing we need to remember is this, that the letters of Matthew and Luke wrote with the details of the birth of Jesus were written around 50 or 60 A.D., which means they were written 50 or 60 years after the birth of Jesus Christ. If you were walking around Bethlehem or Nazareth and were asking people, so what was it like when Jesus was born? There's probably not one person who could tell you other than Mary and Joseph. People had no idea of the facts surrounding the birth of Christ until Matthew and Luke wrote the details of the birth of Christ, other than obviously the shepherds. Which means that people who were reading the story of the birth of Jesus were learning about events that we take for granted, but they were reading them for the first time. When Jesus was born, there were no carols, there were no lights. The night before he was born, all the stores didn't close early. There was no Christmas Eve service. Apart from a handful of people, nobody was aware anything special was even going on. The eyes of the world were on Rome, but the eyes of heaven were on Israel, and Bethlehem in particular. The events of the birth in the first 30 years of Jesus' life, for the most part, all happened in the context of the ordinary, with little bolts of glory shining here and there, and then gone as quickly as they came. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. We certainly see that played out in the Savior's birth. We see the grace of God, the humility of Jesus, the sovereignty of God, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Philip Keller has made this observation. When you begin to tamper with the truths surrounding the birth of Christ, you are not just tampering with tradition. Remember that. We are not just tampering with tradition. We are tampering with the gospel of Jesus Christ. The plan to rescue fallen man, to save him, and how that would be carried out was put in place before time began. And now, after 400 years of silence unknown to anyone, that plan was about to be carried out. As we know, the message that the angels gave to the shepherds that wonderful night on the hillside, for unto you was born this day in the city of David a Savior who was Christ the Lord. And my encouragement to you this week is that may you read the Christmas story, may you read it with fresh eyes. Not skipping through it because you know the story, but digging deep down into it to see the truths you may have missed, to see some brief but glorious rays of glory that you may have overlooked in the past because you knew the story. Just stop and read it slowly and think about what you're reading and rejoice in the message of Christmas, Emmanuel, God with us. That may be a great place to start. Emmanuel, God with us. sit down and just allow that truth to wash over you and think about the implications and the glory of that wonderful truth. So may this truth guide us and guard us in the trenches of life as we seek to live for the glory of God and the good of others. May God bless.